Welcome, everyone. Welcome to one of our global governance lectures. I'm happy to see everyone, all our speakers for today, people joining in the chat. My name is Ksenia Radchenkova. I'm a PhD researcher at the Department of the Global Governance at the University of Graz, and I'm happy to present this event that is organized by Global Governance team. And within this form of global governance lectures, we are always trying to invite specialists from the whole world who can bring their viewpoints and start a discussion on such topics as minority governance, international conflict resolution, and global conflicts as well. So today is one of such lectures with a very interesting top speaker, Dr. Walter Lee from Hong Kong. I think it's it's great news for us that during the time of pandemic still in China, which forbids easy travels in and out from China, we could get a hold on Dr. Lee, at least online. So let me present a little bit more our discussion and our speakers. So during today's workshop, the author of the monograph, Principles and Laws in World Politics, Classical Chinese Perspective on Global Conflict, Dr. Walter Lee, together with 3 discussants from the University of Graz, will discuss contemporary Chinese international relations in light of ancient Chinese philosophy, and then stride into the future searching for common principles and laws guiding modern international relations. The book that lays as a ground source for today's discussion, the book that examines whether knowledge archaeology of Chinese international relations, which is the term coined by the author, responds sensibly to today's issues of international ethics and global justice. So this is broad concept, and now a little bit more about our speakers. Dr. Walter Lee is assistant professor in School of Arts and Social Sciences and program leader of Global and China Studies at Hong Kong Metropolitan University. He specializes in Chinese international relations, in particular the competition and cooperation that China engages in global governance. Concentrating on fundamental research in world politics, he has a broad interest in intellectual history, knowledge production, and cross-disciplinary research that brings political science and humanities into conversation. Our second speaker is Dr. Erika de Wet, Professor of International Law and Head of Institute of International Law and International Relations at the Faculty of Law of the University of Graz. Professor de Wet holds a Master of Law from Harvard University and completed her habilitation at the University of Zurich. She was a professor of international constitutional law at the Amsterdam Center of International Law at the University of Amsterdam, and professor of international law and founding co-director of the Institute for International and Comparative Law in Africa at the University of Pretoria. Her research focus includes the use of force, the law of international organizations, human rights, and the formation of hierarchies in international law, as well as the reception of international law in national law. Our next discussant, and I actually forgot, we have a little bit more pictures here, Dr. Josef Marko, Professor of Comparative Public Law and Political Sciences at the Institute of Public Law and Political Sciences at the University of Graz. Marko has served as one of the 3 international judges at the Constitutional Court of Bosnia and Herzegovina. He was also a member of the Council of Europe Advisory Committee of the Council of Ministers established under the Framework Convention for the Protection of National Minorities. He acted as director of the Institute for Minority Rights at the European Academy in Bolzano, and he served as the Dean of Faculty of Law in Graz. Since July 2016, he has acted as legal advisor to the Special Advisor to the UN Secretary General, Espen Eide, at the Cyprus reunification negotiations. His research focuses on comparative constitutional law and politics, in particular, power sharing in ethnicity-divided societies and the role of constitutional courts, the study of nationalism, minority protection, and ethnic conflicts. And last but not least, Dr. Franz Winter Professor of Religious Studies at the University of Graz, Austria. He has received PhD in Classical Studies and Religious Studies from the University of Vienna and Habilitation in Religious Studies from the same university. After having studied and done researches at the universities of Graz, Salzburg, Vienna, Rome, Boston University, and in Tokyo, Kyoto, in Oman and Iran, so all the countries. Among his major areas of interest are the history of contact between Europe and Asia from antiquity to modern times, history of East Asian religion, history of Buddhism, history of Islam, Western esoterics, religion, and the media. So I'm very happy that today we managed to bring together specialists from such different areas that will allow us probably review the subject interdisciplinary. That's exactly the point that Dr. Lee wanted to bring up in this book. So I hope that our discussion today will exactly show the ways that discussion should be led. Without a further ado, I would like to give the first word to our main speaker, Dr. Walter Lee. The floor is yours, and we are happy to hear from you. So, one moment, I'm giving you the rights of presentation. And we have for the beginning 20 minutes.
Okay, thank you very much, Ksenia. So good morning, everyone. Guten Morgen. So also good afternoon from Hong Kong. So it is really a big pleasure and honor for me to be here to join the discussion of my book today. This is actually the first time I have the opportunity to discuss with experts, scholars from Europe after the publication of my book. So it's very important because, as Ksenia just introduced, part of the purpose of the publication of my book is to initiate the kind of cross-civilizational, cross-cultural dialogue. And we know both Europe and China are very important civilizations in the world. And so this occasion, of course, would be actually a very happy time for us to exchange some of the views. Okay, so I'll actually begin with just a little bit of introduction, general introduction of the book. And then today I'm actually mainly focusing on chapter 7, which is something about the reinventing cosmopolitan ideas in the classical Chinese tradition. So I hope you can all see the slides from your screen there. Okay, so so this book, very interestingly, when I mean, in the past few months, when I introduced my book to many different people in the world, to different universities, libraries, or the colleagues, a lot of them, most of them actually just categorize it as a book in the study of China studies or Chinese studies. But I originally also had a purpose to suggest that, what I have found in the classical Chinese thoughts can also be something useful for the general discipline of politics and international relations and also international law. So, so you actually see I have this purpose here. So this book, of course, I have discussed a lot on the classical Chinese texts, the historical experiences in China about how the states in past, they deal with warfare, diplomacy, international law, those things. But it's not just about China. So, so this is one thing. And the second main point is that I'm actually looking at those things happened back more than 2,000 years ago in China. That was actually before China unified into one single empire. The time was the period was actually from 771 to 221 BC, what we call the pre-Qin era. So I'm actually looking at that period of the time when China was actually divided into different kingdoms, just like Europe. So there has been some discussions on this as well. Some scholars have actually done studies on this. The pre-Qin China at that time compared with early modern Europe, So very similar starting points, but then, of course, China and Europe later developed into very different endings there. So I actually looked into that period and then tried to look for something that would be more inspiring for us to use for nowadays analysis of contemporary politics there. And the study by itself, of course, is cross-civilizational. In the book, I'm not just talking about the Chinese tradition, but I'm also comparing that to nowadays liberal Western conceptions and theories. And I also welcome, I actually have said that in the book that my study is actually just the starting point. I would actually be very happy to see, say, scholars from other civilizations, like from India, from the Islamic tradition, etc., to also suggest their own version of how they can actually take out something from their civilization and then to look at nowadays world. So this is, my attempt is actually just a starting point. And apart from cross-civilizational, this is actually also cross-disciplinary as well. So that's why we are here today. So we have the experts from the discipline of political science, from international law, from religion, philosophy. Okay, so and the focus of my book would also be on the more humanities part. So I talk about history, I talk about laws, ideas, and also the classical texts, how to interpret them. Rather than to just focus on the empirical studies, that would actually be, of course, we know the mainstream of study method in political science, but I'm actually using more humanities methods there. And the goal there for this book is to explore some new directions for global governance, particularly at this time. We have a very, many people would say unstable time. It's actually a unstable time with great transformation. So many people may actually feel quite puzzled. So we actually see if there are actually something useful to be discovered from the classical time and then can be applied in nowadays world. So hopefully this book can provide some alternative perspectives, analysis, and solutions. And what I called the knowledge archaeology of Chinese international relations is actually the pillar of this book. So it is something about the use of classical experiences and also the conceptions, ideas. And where can we find all these things? Of course, it's actually from the text, right? The classical text. So, so how to read these texts would actually be a very important thing, and it's actually a problem of hermeneutics and interpretation. And I'm, of course, not the only one or the first person to do these kind of studies. So in my book, I have also mentioned that, say, for example, in the area of international relations theory, more than 10 years of the time, there has been scholars both in mainland China as well as outside China. They have been, doing works on digging into those classical texts and try to find something useful for the innovation, what we call the innovation in Chinese international relations theory. And in the area of international law, the starting point would be even earlier. That would be actually back in the late 19th century with the American missionary, William A.P. Martin. So he's actually an American who can actually read classical Chinese texts. So very interestingly, when he read Mencius, when he read the 春秋左传, the Chronicle 左, he actually suggests that, okay, there is actually some similarities between, what actually happened back in the pre-Qin time and then what he can find in, say, for example, Hugo Grotius' writing. So, and later, of course, we have other Chinese scholars, say, for example, from the 100 Days Reform, some very famous ones, as we know, say, like, Kang Youwei, Tan Sitong, like those people also have written something on whether we can find some traces of international law in ancient China. So in the area of international political theory as well as international legal theory, there have been debates on whether we can find something in the classical Chinese texts. And in terms of methodology, then in the book I have mentioned that we may actually borrow something from, say, for example, from comparative literature. When we are talking about how we can do this kind of comparative study, say, between the classical Chinese international relations theory and nowadays international relations theory. And for the international laws perspective, then I actually call it comparative jurisprudence because it's actually a difficult case for me because when you look at nowadays international law, it is of course still largely Western products. It's largely European and American experience and the outcome, of the production. And when you want to find something from the Chinese legal tradition, then of course the whole discussion would be in comparative law and in the specific area of East Asian law, right? So if we would like to take out something useful from classical China to be applied to nowadays international law, still, I think, we have a lot of difficulties there. So there is not even a label, like a name for it. So this is actually something about the methodology. And then the case I used in my book would actually be warfare. So humanitarian intervention, just war theory, and the responsibility to protect. And I've actually found that, in the pre-Qin era, then, the philosophers and historians, they already talk a lot about warfare, international ethics, and the rules and regulations which regulates warfare and the moral principles. So you actually see that this is actually just an example to show you on the map. Say from the pre-Qin era on your left-hand side, more than 2,000 years ago with many kingdoms. And on the right-hand side, you have the 16th century Europe. So, of course, we know that in international relations, what we have nowadays, the modern state system is actually from the, a lot of the people say that it's actually from the 1648, the Treaty of Westphalia, right? So it's actually a result of the 30 Years' War in Europe. So it's a result of the religious conflicts, warfare, and then we have the idea of say, okay, we have to respect each other's sovereignty and the rights of religious belief, that kind of things. Back in China, more than 2,000 years ago, you also have a lot of kingdoms fighting against each other. But the main difference there is that the factor of religion in China is actually much weaker than in Europe. And China, after this period of separation, also one very different thing is that China was unified by one hegemon, and it was actually unified into one single empire. But Europe actually remained, as we know, very diverse. You have the balance of power there, and the story is actually different. So, so I actually chose ancient China to talk about this case is because I can actually find something in common, when we compare the two periods, the pre-Qin period and nowadays international relations. As I have said, you have warfare, you have the moral principles in international relations, and also the rules and regulations there. And the main texts are actually these. Okay, I'm not going to read out everything because of the limitation of time. So these are the main texts, historical and also some ritual texts from the pre-Qin period. And I actually quote a very famous line from the Chronicle of Zuo, a historical writing, a very famous historical writing from that period. And it says that the great affairs of the states are ritual sacrifice and warfare. Okay, so so till today, we still see that, in international relations, of course, warfare is actually still a very important issue. And on the other hand, we have the issue of the international institutions and rules and the laws. And back more than 2,000 years ago in China, that would actually be something related to the rights. So, the ritual practice and that has to do with religion, but it also has to do with something with the legal practice as well. Okay, so something about reinventing the cosmopolitan force into Chinese civilization. Now, let me actually jump to these two important ideas first. Usually, when people talk about Chinese cosmopolitan ideas, they will talk about Tianxia and Datong. These are actually very much related concepts, but they are not really the same. The former term, Tianxia, actually is a physical, geographical, as well as a political concept, while the later, Datong, is actually a term referring to moral and political meanings. Okay, and both words, they entail the Chinese worldview and cosmology. So now, when we look at, say, for example, the concept of Tianxia, you will actually see that in the past more than 10 years, there actually has been philosophers and political scientists, both in China and outside China. They have been talking a lot about Tianxia. Say, for example, Professor Zhao Tingyang from the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences. I guess he's one of the most famous scholars talking about how to apply the concept of Tianxia in nowadays international relations. But of course, it's very controversial because, say, for a lot of the overseas observers, say that the foreign scholars, they actually think that, well, the traditional way of reading Tianxia is actually something really hierarchical. It's actually very exclusive. It can even be read in a rather imperial sense, because it's actually something from the imperial time of China, So, so if you look at the third point here, I mean, these 5 points here, down here, you actually see that these are actually some of the traditional ways of looking at Tianxia, So it's hierarchical, as I have said, and China is actually being at the center of the world, and all those people and the tribes, or the so-called nations at the periphery, they would be the barbarians. And it can also be a very inward-looking worldview, So when you look at, I guess, especially in the past more than 600 years of history in China since the Ming Dynasty, if you look at that period, from Ming and to Qing Dynasty, if you interpret Tianxia from that perspective, that's pretty much like that, And say, for example, some famous scholars like the historian John Fairbank of Harvard University, he actually has the term called the tributary system, right? So, but this would only be part of the story to understand Tianxia. And Tianxia actually is actually a conception from the pre-Qing era, but not only from the Ming and Qing dynasty, of course, right? So we have some more useful elements in the ideas in the idea of Tianxia. Say we are talking about it should be an inclusive world. Okay, we are talking about people are all from the same family. Now, you may actually wonder why. On the one hand, you actually have this very seemingly very hierarchical and exclusive way to look at the whole world, but then you also have something quite to the opposite. I guess the main the tricky point there is that because in the past, when the Chinese people they look at the world, nowadays, I mean geographically, the center part of China would actually be already the world. So people, because by that time they didn't know something about far away, say like in Europe or Latin America, the Pacific Ocean. They actually didn't know that. So they actually take the neighborhood, the China's neighborhood, that's actually already a world. And within that world, then you actually have the idea that, okay, we are actually all from the same family. And then we have to respect each other. We have to take care of each other. And then you have this idea of, we have to live in harmony. And in the Chinese civilization, of course, we know one very important thing. The feature is that it's about cultural assimilation. So whoever actually comes into the Chinese culture, then these people are actually being assimilated as a part of the family there. And also one very interesting thing there is, say, back in the pre-Qin era, all the, say, for example, you actually see that we have the different kingdoms, right? And the different kingdoms, actually, they are, in fact, people of the same blood, okay? They're actually from the same family. So they are actually relatives. And if they fight wars, then it will be very difficult for them to later go to the temple and tell their ancestors what they have done. Because usually it's actually said that the ancestors would like the descendants, okay, the children and their grandchildren to take care with each other, but not fighting or killing each other. So if that's the case, that these brothers and sisters, they go killing and hurting each other, then when the time they go to the temple to tell something to their ancestors, it would be actually a very embarrassing moment. So this map also tells you something about the Tianxia. Okay, so it's a rather hierarchical model. Okay, from the middle you actually have the Tianzi. Okay, that's the king, and then further away from the center, then it's actually the relationship is actually not really that close to the center. So it's actually quite hierarchical. And a lot of these ideas are actually from discoveries by archaeologists, say, from the relics, when they read those very old texts. And even for the term China, nowadays what we call China, in the Chinese characters, 中国, that's two words are actually from such a bronze vessel. And this is also just another representation. Okay, at the center you have the emperor, and then further away, then the relationship is actually less close. Right? And the other very important idea is Datong. And I guess nowadays when we talk about cosmopolitan ideas, this would actually be more relevant to our study, because if you want to ask what kind of utopian ideas that classical China has, this would actually be one very important thing we will actually mention. So it's a kind of ultimate and highest idealistic dream that the humankind can achieve. Okay, so what we call the great harmonious world, and in such a world, then the society is just, and people are amiable and cooperative, resources are plentiful, and equality is the norm, and violence and conflicts are far away from us. And some people may also identify it as something quite similar to maybe communism, the kind of the utopian idea of that, if you look at that from that angle. Okay. So, and if you compare this to the Western concept of utopianism, you actually see this Chinese conception of Datong emphasizes the exercise of relationship among people more. Okay, so it's very Confucian. It's about role playing. It's about the implementation of virtues and the realization of what we call Dao. Okay, the way. Here I actually just quote from two sections from the classical text. So the upper one, of course, is a very famous one from the Book of Rites. So in a society of Datong, then you actually see that when the Dao is actually there, then people, they actually behave well. Okay, so a public and common spirit rule all under the sky. So in the whole world, they chose men of talents, virtue, and ability. Their words were sincere, and what they cultivated was harmony. Thus men did not love their parents only, nor treat as children only their own sons. Okay, so everybody can call each other brothers and sisters. And also, of course, we know among all the classical philosophers in ancient China, Mozi is actually a person who actually vividly promoted the idea of universal love. So this is actually a statement from him. So to regard the states of others as one's own, the houses of others as one's own, the persons of others as one's self. When feudal lords love one another, there will be no more war. When heads of houses love one another, there will be no more mutual usurpation, and something like that. Okay, so this is actually just a citation from Morse. So 天下 and 大同 are actually two important ideas. Usually people would talk about, but I would actually also suggest there is also something very important.
Walter, just quickly interrupting, just saying that it's already over 25 minutes.
Okay, I'll just quickly finish. Okay, just one more point here. It's about the understanding of common suffering. So, and this one will actually be more from the Buddhist philosophy. Okay, my point here is that true cosmopolitanism requires us to deconstruct and reconstruct our political, social, and cultural identity. We will need to be aware that we belong to the same species and the same family. So how to grow such awareness? My opinion is that we have to grow such awareness by understanding we all suffer for very similar reasons, and we need to face our common sufferings together. And from the perspective of Buddhist philosophy, that would be the concept of compassion, or even there is another term called karuna. That means it's not just to face the sufferings together, but to alleviate them together. So, so this actually requires non-discrimination, non-self. Okay, so so this is actually from the Buddhist philosophy. But then, if you look at the Confucius philosophy, especially from Mencius, the idea of Liangzhi and also Ceyin, so something related to conscience, right? These are also very useful concepts as well. So I guess because of the limitation of time, I actually better just stop here, and I'll actually maybe explain more in the following sections. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Lee. Thank you very much for this introduction. I'm sure we will hear much more in further discussions, but at the moment I would like to give a word to our next speaker, Professor de Wet. Please, your 10 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Lee, for this very, very insightful presentation. I will start with my comments are going to be rather critical with questions to which I would like to hear your opinion. Let me first of all make clear that when I sound rather critical here, everybody who knows me and my work will know that I'm rather critical by nature in any case, and that this is not a criticism that I only raise vis-à-vis China. While I do uphold Western values and do, see those as my own, I am fully aware of the suffering that Western major powers have caused in the past through colonialism, through the illegality of the Iraq War, through the abuse of the legal mandate in Libya, to name but two examples. So I don't want this comment to my critical comments that will follow as suggesting that I'm blind to the faults of others or that I intend to be disrespectful. I'm just trying to understand how you are connecting the fact that the issue of human suffering, which as you actually articulated it, how you connect that to some of the realities which are currently going on around us. So there were two things. It was the issue of human suffering, and I'll give you concrete examples. And also one of the many interesting points that you also raised concerns the fact that the foreign actors have to conform to the Chinese system of values. And so I see a certain tension between accommodation, pluralism, as we would call it in political science as well, legal pluralism as well, and social pluralism on the one hand, accommodating others, with the idea that foreign actors have to conform to the Chinese system of values. and also to the issue of human suffering, which we all want to abolish. How does this tolerance and this pluralism and the human suffering, how do you explain the treatment of the Uyghurians in China through this paradigm? That's my first question. And as somebody who spent 33 years on the African continent, I'm South African born, although I'm now a proud Dutch national, I'm deeply concerned when I observe the kind of crimes against nature and the societies which are happening there, which Western countries have, through colonization in the 19th until the mid-20th century, have been perpetuating, in a way being it's happening again in the way that there is state capture between African states by the Chinese government. But I have to say, this time around, not with brutal force, but with willingness and cooperation of cynical African governments who do not care for the welfare of their people. I'm thinking here of the fact that wildlife, climate change and the whole issue of wildlife, it's a huge issue. Wildlife in Africa is being decimated by inter alia and gangs from Southeast Asia, and also from Chinese gangs who export the rhinoceros and the chimpanzees and a few other threatened animals to Asia, including to China. There's a plundering of resources. There's no exchange of transfer of knowledge. It is true that then there's an agreement between the Chinese government and African governments that, for example, China will provide developing aid or financial aid, will provide a new road or a railroad or a hospital or, something really useful to society. But in so doing, they bring their own people, their own resources. There's no transfer of knowledge. And there tends to be huge tensions between the Chinese coming in and the local population. Once again, this is something, so in fact, we have now a situation where the Chinese military and Marines and Air Force have been established legally under international law by means of treaty across the continent without China having needed to fire a single shot. Now, from the perspective of political strategy, this was masterful. It was very smartly done. But it means that there's been state capture of a number of countries on the African continent in a way replicates what the West has done before. Okay, I'm not saying that this China is the only one. We have an action replay here, slightly different methods, but with the same result, and a very unfortunate result that, as a result of which, also my former country, South Africa, was not willing or able to vote against the aggression against Ukraine because it didn't suit political, economic interests. They are too dependent on China and the other BRICS countries to dare to speak out against what is happening there. So I'm exceptionally critical of that conduct. I have immense difficulty of understanding how you are reconciling that with ethics and the absence of human suffering. And to me, there seems not to be any accommodation of other cultures. And it seems to me that, unfortunately, China in its currently is repeating some of the worst excesses of abuse of power that Western countries have been doing for the last 300 years. So I don't think we're heading anywhere near peace. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor de Wet. Dr. Lee, I think after all our three discussants say their view, you will have a chance to answer each one of them. Yeah. So first, let's collect the views, and then we will discuss them. Thank you very much, Professor de Wet. And now I would like to give the word to Professor Marko. Please.
Thank you so much, Ksenia. Yeah. I would like to come back again from the realist perspective and try to come back a little bit also into the idealist perspective. And I see this is obviously one of the common structures of knowledge generation we have in what you say the civilizations, both civilizations, China and Europe. When you speak about Tianxia and Datong, and of course, what are the ideas on the one hand and what is done in actual fact on the other hand are, of course, two different stories. Again, my interest in your book was very much raised by your introductory chapter that you would like to overcome the Chinese and China-West dichotomy. And also I got the feeling over the last couple of months or even years now, going hand in hand with the rise of Xi Jinping within the Communist Party of China and the policies of the Chinese Communist Party, that we discuss more and more in terms of geopolitics. So that geopolitics has become also a theoretical, methodological, hegemonic discourse in international relations. And therefore, I found your approach to say, well, we have also to deal with hermeneutics, rely on the humanities and the methods of the humanities, very interesting. By the way, I have also published a book in 2019 with colleagues of mine under the title Human and Minority Rights Protection by Multiple Diversity Governance from a European perspective. Being fully aware, of course, of the history of ideas since Greek civilization, which is, of course, coining our basic concepts to the very day. So I think that your approach to use comparative history is a very interesting approach and very useful approach, also to overcome this hegemonic discourse of geopolitics. And insofar as I think also Europe and European politics and policies can only be understood in its deeper structures from the perspective of basic concepts and ideas developed not only hundreds of years ago. You mentioned already the Westphalian peace order, but also due to the for instance, papal revolution in the 13th century, 12th century, 13th century, with the conflict between the emperor of the Holy Roman Empire on the one hand and the Catholic Pope on the other hand, which was also a very decisive phase in European history for our understanding of the use of concepts we try to think of until the very day. So sovereignty is, of course, obviously an idea and a concept with quite different meanings, maybe. And when you look into European history, you can see the different transformations also in the meaning of the concept of sovereignty due to the political developments on the ground within the area of Europe, what we call Europe today. Having said that, of course, I also do have some critical questions, so that we do not have only common points of understanding. Maybe that one of the basic structures in also Greek thinking and not only Chinese thinking is this basic dichotomy of chaos and order on the one hand, and how to overcome the dichotomy between chaos and order by Tianxia and Datong, as you try to explain from an idealistic, as far as I understand, perspective. However, my critical comments are again when you refer to the need for an emancipated Leviathan. This is one of the most interesting phrases you use in your book. You did not use it in the presentation, but again in the book, the Leviathan, the emancipated Leviathan. And of course, the question is, what does the Chinese emancipated, how different is the Chinese emancipated Leviathan from Hobbes' conceptualization of Leviathan? And in this regard, I see also that very often you also question very much liberalism and capitalism, as one of the basic errors of human development. And of course, then comes to my mind the question in the end, which I see as the most important and also critical question, is what is now the difference between liberalism on the one hand and cosmopolitanism, either the European way or the Chinese way on the other hand, when we talk, as this has been done before by Professor de Wet, on human rights. Is it possible, to say, well, liberalism is intimately connected with the idea of universalism and human rights, in particular against the protection as a mechanism of protection against suffering of the people. But what is cosmopolitan all about then? Yeah, when you speak about the great harmony. What is the great harmony? And you make the difference between equality on the one hand and hierarchy on the other hand. But again, this is a very abstract level, equality and hierarchy. In Europe, we are discussing in much more detail the specific meaning of equality, individual equality before the law, or also when we speak about the protection of minorities, which is my special field of research for 3 decades now, is that we also talk about affirmative action measures, or as it is called in European Union law, positive measures. To say, well, equality is of course not the same for everybody. Of course, there is a lot of political philosophy, in particular Anglo-Saxon philosophers, which would deny the justification for affirmative action, and say this any sort of affirmative action is by definition also reverse discrimination. So again, the very conceptualization and meaning of equality and discrimination, anti-discrimination, is, I think, a very important starting point also for an intercultural and cross-cultural dialogue, in terms of what do you mean by equality, for whom and how. And in this respect, in the end, I wonder whether also the cosmopolitan universalism, or is this a contradiction per se, to speak about cosmopolitan universalism, will lead to another social and political ordering of societies. So the question is universalism, as you define it, by definition, a Western concept, an exclusive Western concept, by definition leading to neocolonialism, as this was already introduced by Professor de Wet? Or is cosmopolitan universalism a contradiction in itself? Or is it exactly the way you look for to say, well, there is at least an interpretation beyond dichotomies, as such, and to say, well, this is what I would call inclusive universalism. But on the other hand, when you speak about the emancipated Leviathan, again, the question raises for me, how serious do you take the idea of a inclusive cosmopolitanism, and isn't in the end thinking critically from an ideological perspective, cosmopolitan then simply not the same thing like liberalism you criticize, because again, liberalism in the Western conceptualization presents it as the framework, or giving the procedural rules for free choice on substantive questions. So is liberalism superior to communism, conservatism, other ideologies? But the same can be said then about cosmopolitanism. Why is cosmopolitanism a superior ideology in relation to liberalism? And in the end, when we translate these questions back into realism and geopolitics, then of course George Orwell comes to my mind with his novel of 1984. And what is now your prediction for the next 10, 20 years in terms of international relations? Is it again a development that we will see 3 or 4 great powers dominating international relations? Or do you think that the emancipated Leviathan can come into existence, triggered by whom? Yeah, and how will it act in the end, the emancipated Leviathan? Or is all this talk about Datong, the great harmony, simply one of these 36 strategies? You know, these famous or infamous 36 stratagems of Sanqi Liu Ji. This is, so to speak, yeah, one of the stratagems in order to deceive, yeah, the outside world. This is my question in the end. How serious is it to think about an inclusive cosmopolitan worldview, which is no longer challenged as a Western imperialism or the other way around, Chinese imperialism?
Thank you, Professor Marko. Thank you. Thank you. And the next word is given to Professor Winter, please.
Yeah. Thank you very much. I'd like to keep my comments brief, hopefully brief enough. First of all, I'd like to thank Professor Lee for his impressive book. For me, it was a treasure trove full of ideas, concepts, interesting thoughts, and also stimulating material that I really like to read. My first side interpretation was that your book makes up part of a growing literature that tries to introduce ancient Chinese literature and its presupposed major concepts to the West, with the idea to make it fruitful for discussion on how to reconceptualize, for example, a new world order. It is rooted in a growing interest amongst Chinese intellectuals and the cultural tradition starting in the last decade, which is also a kind of renaissance, taking into account the massive upheavals and recalibrations, not to say self-destructive phases in regard to its own tradition in the history of China, particularly in the second half of the 20th century. So it has a lot to do with self-orientation. However, when reading your book, I was a little bit surprised about the changing lines of argumentation, and in the end, I had the impression that there were 2 different books in front of me. I really liked the first part, where you're introducing your concepts, particularly this, what you refer to as knowledge archaeology of Chinese international relations. My impression was, and this is also a question whether I got this correctly, that you're trying to locate your own approach amongst, but also in contrast to other contemporary approaches to ancient Chinese traditions as provided by some important authors. And this was very informative. You might note that there are only a few authors whose works has been translated or who published in a Western language. One striking proof for this negligence is the fact that when it comes, for example, to German, there is only one author who has been translated, and you mentioned him already. This is Zhao Dingyang with his publications on the NCR system, a book which has been criticized substantially as soon as it was published. And the criticism of Zhao's book has a lot to do with one crucial aspect of this recent literature, growing literature, namely the fact that there is a general suspicion that all the new interest is mainly focused on the idea to find a proper explanation and a substantial support for the future role of China in the world. By highlighting specific aspects of ancient Chinese concepts, China is introduced as the better new hegemonic culture, as it allegedly had a tradition of a rather benign, non-interventionist, but harmonious way of acting, particularly when it comes to international and transnational contacts. This claim is quite obvious in the publications of Zhao Dingyang, but it is also an aspect in the more elaborated and also internationally better known works by Yan Xuedong, who was published prominently amongst others also at Princeton University Press, and who introduced the idea of a moderated authoritarian world rulership as the new top model based on his analysis of ancient Chinese concepts. As far as I understood your position, I would suggest that you are trying to find a middle way, at least in the first portion of the book, which is going back to ancient sources without the presupposition of a kind of China first ideology that is quite prominent in the authors I mentioned. You want to get rid of this general problematic stance of most of the literature by taking a fresh look on ancient texts and trying to let them speak to us without this obvious agenda that is so common in other authors. Particularly, I was very fascinated by the introduction also of or your interpretation of the word Taodong, which was already put forth prominently now, which was introduced by Kang Yu Mei in the 19th century. However, although I really liked this part of your book, which was the first portion, I still had the impression that you're also stepping in this trap that is typical of this kind of literature, and this became particularly obvious in the later portion of your book. And it was, as I said, coming as a surprise for me, as I had the impression of being confronted with two different books, two different authors. In the later part, in the second portion, you're using a rather rough schematization that is guided by an aversion towards what you refer as liberalism, that is presented as the signum of Western politics and Western political systems. In your view, liberalism is identified with hedonism, is intrinsically related to an expansionist, interventionist political agenda that is primarily connected to the US and its international politics in the 20th century. In one of your passages, you are even using the expression, which I found quite funny and quite interesting, cosmopolitan jihadis. And as far as I understood this phrase, it refers to propagators of this kind of liberalist ideology. While I would not defend all the things that have been done in all the attempts to promote this kind of ideology, but still there is the question whether your approach towards the history of the West is not too simple, too rough, so to say. This goes along with some minor issues or some critical remarks in regard to some of the points you're raising, and this is always connected to an, at least from my point of view, illegitimate idealization of China. One instance would be your claim that the idea of the self-cultivation of the ruler is a specific Chinese thing, and you even explicitly maintain that there is nothing comparable in the West. So there is the Chinese concept that the ruler has to be educated and self-educated. But this is simply wrong. I'd like to point you to a long tradition of European educational literature that was written, for example, for kings, or was written by kings for their successors, for their sons. In medieval time, this was a special genre which was called the mirrors of principles, specula principum. Most of them, of course, conceptualized within a Christian frame, but the major idea of all that literature was, of course, that the ruler has to be educated and has to educate himself along specific guidelines that are exposed in this kind of literature. To sum up, your book is inspiring, but at the end, at least in my perception, it is one more book about the alleged superiority of Chinese wisdom when compared to Western concepts. As in all these books, there is a major question which was raised already by Professor Marko, and this is who is at the end the one who will coordinate this work of this kind of rulership of these new concepts? Who appoints, to ask it openly, the idea ruler under which categories? How do we choose such a superhuman entity? I do have also a major reserve when it comes to concepts, and you are explicitly referring to them, concepts which are related to a kind of, I call it now, transcendental sphere, the Tao, or once you even used the term creator, as a kind of supra-model for political system. I personally think that purely democratic systems without a faults are still better than everything that is superimposing additional, rather weight principles above. And I'm very suspicious about everything and everyone who wants to sell something like harmony to me. Which brings me to my last remark, and this is relating to one of your questions, namely whether it makes sense to fully delve in ancient Chinese texts for self-education. Although I'm, as you might guess, a religious studies scholar, a big fan of reading ancient texts of various countries, one has to be aware that the ideas that are contained in ancient Chinese literature are framed within a political, cultural, and social context that is guided by the idea of a strong authoritarian hierarchical rulership. It is about strictly hierarchical societies with a highly stratified model of different ranks in top-down order, where those who are ruled have to find their proper places according to their functionality in the various social ranks. So there's nothing about there's nothing like individualities in these concepts, and the idea of one's own personal development that is not only guided by the idea of functioning within an alleged harmonious society is absolutely absent. So this would be my remarks, hopefully not too critical, but some of them, of course, in accordance with what was said already. But thank you for your publication.
Thank you very much, Professor Winter. Thank you all the discussants for brilliant remarks, very thought-provoking ideas. I believe Professor Walter Lee will now answer all the points. And Dr. Lee, you can also incorporate them with your own questions that you wanted to ask to our discussants to continue then the discussion in your manner, right, with your own questions. Please.
Okay, so maybe I just spend some time to answer the questions first before we go to the questions, right? Just very briefly, a lot of questions. Thank you very much for three of you. The first thing I would like to say is that for all the classical Chinese ideas or the thoughts, anyone can use them. It's not just the Communist Party of China or the Chinese government. And I'm actually not a representative of the Chinese government or the Communist Party at all. And that's actually a very important point, because you actually see that, say, for my background, I'm actually from Hong Kong. I was born in Hong Kong and raised up in Hong Kong. And when I talk to my colleagues, or even when I was a student talking to my teachers, teaching classical Chinese literature or history, I can say that most of them, they are not really sharing the same points that you can now listen from the, Chinese government. And the same thing, say that when I talk to my Taiwanese friends or some of the overseas Chinese friends, because the Chinese population is actually so big, and when you go to different places, you actually have different Chinese people talking to you, looking at the same thing. Say, for example, looking at Confucius or those classical ideas from very different angles. And for for us here in Hong Kong, after 1949, the establishment of the PRC, we actually, of course, very famous. We actually did have a group of Neo-Confucian scholars who actually fled from mainland China, and a lot of them, they actually stayed at nowadays what we call the Chinese University of Hong Kong, and including historians like Qian Wu, Mao Zhongshan. Those are actually philosophers as well, and they were actually very critical of the mainland, but they were actually, scholars of traditional Chinese philosophy and history. So this is actually one point I would like to raise. Okay, so my point is that it's not just the party states of China can actually have this interpretation, but of course nowadays from the media or even from the academic discussions, we actually know that, say, for example, the scholars from mainland China, quite a lot of them, they are actually heavily influenced by the official rhetoric, right? The way how China should actually look at the world. So I can't say all of them, but then my observation is that quite a lot of them, they have to follow, to a large extent, the party line or the official discourse there. I myself, not necessarily, and that's why I would actually, in my book, I've actually suggested that the approach we need to use perhaps would actually be a non-nationalistic and non-ethnocentric perspective. And of course, we also noticed that, for scholars looking into the classical text, we do have Western scholars too. In the US, in the UK, in Europe as well, we do have foreign scholars who can also read classical Chinese. And some of them, they may not reach classical Chinese, but then they can also rely on some second-hand information, and they also do that kind of research. So my belief is that this system, it should be actually open. And the second point is that when we are talking about what to do with these, innovation of ideas, we always have three different things. There is like a triangle. First, you actually have the classical Chinese thoughts, and second, you have nowadays Chinese party states ideology, and of course that politically speaking, that has a lot of influence and impacts on other things. And thirdly, you actually have the current liberal platform that's actually set up by the West. That's actually also the global one. For many Chinese scholars, including the philosophers or political scientists, they are quite, sometimes they are trapped. Sometimes they actually feel quite happy to sort of move around all these three different areas, And I guess if you're asking me that, so what would the future be, for the development of the Chinese theories? I guess it has to be among these three different areas, whether you actually see that people would actually stick more really to the party state side, or they are more ethnocentric, really talking about the classical Confucian things, or they are actually taking reference of, the Western perspectives. So, the three aspects, they all have impacts on the future development of the Chinese thought. So this would actually be something very important, I would say. And for Professor de Wet's questions, I think from a very realist perspective, to a certain extent, I agree with you. And that's actually quite inevitable, when it comes to great power politics. In the past you have some of the Western countries, like, the British Empire, and then nowadays the United States, and China now is actually growing. So when you are growing, then inevitably you are actually like growing bigger, and then, some other smaller countries, they will actually feel your impact. And not all the impacts can be positive, of course, right? You've actually, I guess, touched on, say, some of the actions can be from the state, some can actually be related to the corporations from China, the companies as well. And I will also say that sometimes even for the people, just like the workers from China, when a lot of them nowadays, they are working in Africa or some other developing countries, the kind of cultural, misunderstanding, or, the way they actually deal with the local people, there are actually problems, of course, we know. So, but for that part, that's actually not something my book's actually dealing with. Sorry about that, but I do understand what you mean. And also you have mentioned that there is a problem about whether we are asking foreigners to conform to the Chinese values or something like that. I've actually heard about that from other scholars for some time already. I think that's actually something I don't want to see. I would actually like to really to sort of liberate, and that's why you actually see that I use the word emancipation for many times in my book, to really emancipate the interpretation of those classical ideas for the use of everybody in the world. It's not necessarily that the Chinese government or the Chinese scholars, they are the only agents or the only actors who can actually use them. I mean, if you guys are interested, feel free. I mean, everyone can actually dig into something. To this pool and then find something useful, because in terms of post-civilizational dialogue, like all the ideas we can find in these civilizations, not just the Chinese civilization, they are the common treasures of the humankind anyway. So. So this would actually be my response. And for Professor Marko, something related to order and chaos. Very interesting at that point. I personally think that perhaps I didn't make it very clear in my book, but my understanding or even my argument will be there are actually always some problem in Confucianism, and especially because from the Han Dynasty's time, it's more than 2,000 years already. Confucianism has been sort of controlled or even manipulated by what we call legalism, something quite related to Machiavellianism, I guess, in the Western tradition for thousands of years. And Confucianism for a long time, it has actually been used by the Chinese rulers to use as a kind of political tool. What I would actually appreciate more in the Chinese tradition would actually be the Taoist and also the Buddhist philosophy. And usually in the Chinese tradition, we say that Confucianism and Taoism and Buddhism, these are the three major pillars, right? They are all very important. But then usually when people come across with Chinese tradition, they only look at Confucianism, and I don't know why. I guess there is real wisdom, especially say like in Taoism, say if you read Lao Tzu, if you read Zhuangzi, you actually see that they actually understand the world as, it's actually in chaos, when you go into the jungle, and when you look at the animals and when you feel the wind, and then, you actually see that, well, there is always something unpredictable in the nature. But then within this kind of chaos, you can always find something related to order. That's actually sort of a higher level of understanding of order. That's actually not the humanly constructed or socially constructed order, but then the order of the natural world. So can we actually observe something from that? There will be actually another issue we can talk about. And for the idea of emancipated Leviathan, I actually didn't really say China is actually the only option. I guess I was actually really referring to great powers, but then any power, even the United States or Europe as a whole, or Russia, I don't know, if you actually have this awareness of how to alleviate sufferings of the people, and this kind of cosmopolitan view, and on the other hand, of course, you have to be powerful. Then you can actually help, right? So I guess this is my very simple response. And let me see. And for the for equality, again, that has to do with our understanding of the three traditions in China, because Confucianism, I guess, to a large extent is hierarchical. Even for me, I guess I can't find much about equality in Confucian's writings. But if you look at Buddhist philosophy, then there will be more. And that kind of equality is actually not just equality among human beings, but also for all forms of life, And I guess that would actually be even be useful when we are nowadays talking about environmentalism or animal rights, that kind of things. So so depends on which tradition we are talking about. And let me see. What else? Something related to the prediction of the future. Well, that's really an important question. The idea of emancipation Leviathan is just a kind of imagination I have. I don't necessarily have that kind of, I guess the ability to foresee, this would actually be something we will see in the coming 10 years or 20 years. Leviathan, of course, there is always a Leviathan or some Leviathans, but for the emancipated part, it would be very difficult. I actually originally had that idea because I had the feeling that whenever we talk about the utopian or idealistic ideas, at the end of the day, we all know those are actually very good things, but then we actually don't have that power to really put those ideas into practice. So, so it's actually a dilemma, And you may still, of course, feel free to criticize. I may still be, overly utopian or idealistic. But then is actually a kind of observation of, both the idealistic side and the very realist side of, of the international politics there. So I think, well, the US for the coming 10 or 20 years will still be the world's, the most important power, of course. People nowadays are talking about the so-called relative decline of the US, but I think the country actually has a very strong foundation. It has its own problem, of course, as we know. It has a lot of problems, especially internally nowadays. But then it's still a strong power. And then look at the nowadays current, the norms and the common platforms we have internationally. Still largely, the US is actually behind. And whether we'll actually see a faster speed of transformation to the other side, say that the rising powers, it depends on, it's not just China rising by itself, but also how many countries are actually on China's side. Nowadays people are also talking about, say, for example, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. So that's actually an example to show you, China, maybe it also understand that, well, if you would like to really compete with the US leadership, then you can't actually, of course, just do it by yourself. The Central Asian countries or even some of the South Asian countries from the developing world, then I guess they would like to create their own new norms and institutions. But then, of course, if you are going to invite other countries, say like the European countries, to join, then it really depends on whether you have this kind of attractiveness or not. You can't actually force people to join, of course, right? So, yeah, so that's actually something I can actually say. And for, let me see, for Professor Winter, Ksenia, I guess you...
Just one little remark. There is one incoming question from Professor de Wet, probably in response to your comments. She wanted to ask something later on when you are...
Oh, okay, thank you. So I just quickly finish with Professor Winter's comments as well. The two different books. Thank you very much. That's a very, I guess, very accurate observation. You are actually the second scholar who actually told me something like that. Previously, Professor Daniel Bell, a philosopher, in Chinese philosophy, he also told me something like that on another occasion. So perhaps it would actually be better to separate into two books. It's better for for my CV as well. I don't know. But anyway, so let me see. The later part, right? The later part on the critiques on liberalism. I just had a feeling that, well, of course, I have to make a footnote here. Liberalism is actually something it is actually a product, a very useful product of the human civilization, from the modernity, right? I'm actually not saying that, okay, everything about liberalism is actually bad, of course. It has actually provided a basic platform for us, like, say, for example, living now the 21st century, the basic, say, for example, the coverage of basic human rights, and the idea of democracy, the rule of law, a lot of the progress we have in the modern world is actually a product of this trend of thought, of course. But I would also like to say that, of course, all political forces, just like all political systems, they have their pros and cons. Okay, they have their strengths and weaknesses. And what actually maybe sometimes really comes to my nerves is that you see how liberalism has developed into nowadays stage. I think it's actually a little bit different from the original goals, and the intentions. So, my understanding of liberalism would be actually a very mild and moderate political position. When you are pursuing liberal democracy and a pluralistic society. You need toleration. You celebrate diversity, right? And you have a very healthy and vibrant civil society there, and the communication between the government and the society would actually be, very smooth. You actually have this kind of understanding. But then nowadays, when you look around the world, you actually see that we have a lot of problems, even in liberal societies. And especially when, and this is actually just my personal view, especially when I see that, in some societies, when people are going further and further going into the more extreme side, from a rather moderate liberal to a libertarian, right-wing, far-right perspective, then the society is so polarized. And originally, we should have solidarity in a healthy liberal democracy, but then that kind of solidarity, is actually like becoming weaker and weaker. So to say that we have problems in liberal societies doesn't mean that we say that the other side is actually having all the best elements, right? Of course I do have my critics on other forms of governments as well, but then if I can actually clarify some of my arguments of liberalism. That would actually be my answer. And for the issue of cultivation of the ruler, I think my clarification would be this. Of course, it should not be just something you can find in the Chinese tradition. I guess when I talk about these points, I was also talking about a book published by Professor Anthony Carty and Jan Nishman. It's something related to moral responsibility of the ruler. That book was that's actually a thick book as well, published by Oxford University Press. And these scholars, they were actually comparing the European rulers in the past as well as the Confucian ideal of the virtuous leaders as well. So I find it actually quite inspiring. So definitely not just China, of course. If there is actually an impression for you that this book is somewhat, promoting an idea that the Chinese elements are always superior to the Western elements, then well, sorry, it's actually, originally I didn't meant to be to be in that way. But perhaps because I have discussed a lot about the Chinese findings, and I have actually find quite a lot of these ideas maybe quite interesting. So my attitude, of course, should be actually quite positive about them. So my original attitude there would actually be, okay, we can actually find something useful from the Chinese tradition. But for other traditions, Western and also, like Indian or Islamic, of course, there could also be something very useful as well. So, maybe I just stop here first and see if any of you would have some response.
Thank you, Dr. Lee. Please, Dr. de Wet.
Thank you so much. I just wanted to express a word of gratitude and a word of thanks since I have to leave at 11:30 due to illness. But I want to thank Dr. Lee for what was really a fascinating discussion, and also Professor Marko and Professor Winter. I learned a lot from all three panelists, and if there's one thing that is very clear to me, or is even clearer after this discussion, is that we need more engagement with Asia, with China in particular, when going forward. And I would also like to thank those who organized this very important panel. For me, it was very enriching. And also thank you so much for your detailed engagement with all the questions. I really admire that, and that you listened so carefully and went to such great lengths to give answers. So I unfortunately have to leave, but thank you so much, and I wish you the very best for the rest of the discussion.
Thank you very much, Professor de Wet. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor de Wet. Get better. All the best. We still have a few minutes left. Yes, and Professor Marko, I will give you the word right away. And for our listeners, please, if you have questions, write them in the chat. We will try to address them, please. And Professor Marko, yes.
Yeah, thank you so much. I would like to come back to my question, what is the relationship between liberalism and cosmopolitanism? Because you spoke of an utopian dilemma. And I must confess, that I'm also have troubles with this utopian dilemma. Is cosmopolitanism now really the way out of this trap to have a dichotomy between China and the West, between idealism and realism, and maybe even when you think about the discourses in geopolitics now about the Thucydides trap, also comparative history is obviously trapped with this geopolitical thinking. So for me, it is still a big question. I did write a full chapter in this book I mentioned. What makes the difference in judicial review with regard to the protection of liberal human rights, so to speak, and the use of the proportionality principle in the adjudication of apex courts like the German Constitutional Court or the US Supreme Court or the European Court of Justice, and what would be a cosmopolitan law in the making, because you have several judgments where in the end the respective courts refer to the concept of human dignity. So no longer as individual freedom as the superior value, being given the top of the value pyramid, but human dignity. And again, there is a lot of debate in the jurisprudence in Western countries. What is human dignity all about? Is human dignity simply an empty shell covering each and everything? Is it even part of natural law, of positive law, as this is the case in Germany, as you know, with Article 1 of the Basic Law? Or is it simply a natural law conception? And is it now necessary to have also a return in the legal sciences to natural law conceptions? And how do you see this quest, even not even possibility, but also necessity maybe, also to have a return, a renovation, a reinvention, as you call it, of natural law thinking in jurisprudence. So, but the basic question is, how do we differentiate liberalism and cosmopolitanism? Are these simply two different ideological worldviews, or are they twins, simply twins, and there are only minor differences between these two worldviews? This is my question.
And before we go to the answer, please, one more question from Franz Winter. He also wanted to ask, and then we'll...
Yeah, just two brief comments. First of all, I think I understood your book correctly. As I said at the beginning, this is a book which is not with this China first ideology, which is typical for Zhao Dingyang, for example, Yan Xuefang, but you want to read the text anew. So this is, I think I understood it correctly, but particularly the first part of your book. This is my first comment. And the second comment is, I was quite intrigued by the fact that now in this presentation you were focusing on Buddhism and Taoism as so to say the major resources in a wider sense of the word. But unfortunately this is not so prominent in the book. I think this could be stressed a little bit more, because your book, Buddhism for example, doesn't play a major role. And also, I mean, Taoism is referred to with this concepts Tao and this kind of thing. But this, I think, can be stressed because your book is mostly about Confucian and also the legalism and the wrong interpretation of Confucianism. So just two brief comments. Thank you.
Please, Dr. Lee. Yes, you have two questions to answer.
Okay, thank you. So, Professor Marko, I think cosmopolitanism and liberalism, they are not of course, they are not totally the same. Now, my understanding is that, of course, these two are actually concepts we have from the Western tradition, okay? And for cosmopolitanism, it actually has a way longer history, of course. We know that usually people would talk about, say, Diogenes or Cynic, back in the ancient Greece time, who actually claims himself as a world citizen. So this kind of idea has a long history, but for liberalism, it's rather a modern idea. It actually has to do with the Enlightenment's, production. So, the kind of cosmopolitanism nowadays we are talking about, I guess, is largely interpreted by the liberal values. So it's a kind of liberal type of cosmopolitanism, and I'm sure there would be scholars also discussing other types of cosmopolitanisms as well. So mainly, of course, in the Western academia. And for the Chinese side, of course, and I guess that's why I say scholars like Zhao Tingyang, when they talk about the idea of 天下, 天下大同, when they would like to make foreigners understand their ideas, then the word, when it's translated into the English language, they have to use the word cosmopolitanism. I guess there is no better word in the English language for them to use. So, but whether 天下大同 is exactly really something that, say, Westerners understand cosmopolitanism, that would be another question. You actually have some sort of linguistics problem there. So, so this is one thing. And the second thing is that, if it is not cosmopolitanism, then I'm actually quite happy to use another term. Maybe we can actually invent another term for the thing I'm actually looking for. My understanding, why I was actually talking about the idea to reinvent cosmopolitanism is that because we all know that nowadays we have a lot of common problems in the world. From climate change to global inequality, we have nowadays, geopolitical crisis as well, energy, etc., all these kind of things. We need cooperation. That's actually the thing I believe in. We need more dialogue, conversation and cooperation, rather than to just have like sanctions or, isolation, decoupling. That kind of action towards each other. So in order to have more conversation and cooperation, we have to build that platform, that common platform. And that common platform actually has to do with we should actually share a common understanding of our identity. So that identity would actually be, the most convenient way to put it would be cosmopolitan, but it can also be, we can also use another label, another word to describe it. But I guess the core value there would be, we have to acknowledge that we are one. Okay, we are actually the same species. Sometimes when I talk to my students, it's actually quite a funny thing. I sometimes I tell them as well. I just say that if the dogs and the cats, or the horses, they look at us, human beings can actually just kill each other. It would be actually quite ridiculous, because in the animal world, it's like, animals of different types, they will actually eat up each other, of course, right? They will actually, play on each other. But then, for the same species, of course, they can also fight, but then it's not something like, to really eliminate each other or something like that, we are, no matter which nation we are from, we are all from the same species. And this kind of understanding plus, what I actually talked about in my speech earlier, the understanding of common suffering there. So, useful for us to establish a kind of common identity. And I think I'm actually not really the first one to say that maybe we should focus more on suffering. Say, many years ago, there was a very famous American political scientist, Barrington Moore. He also talks about, there are many different ways for human beings to pursue happiness, but the origin of sufferings are actually very similar. oppression, wars, inequality, poverty. We have to address these problems together. So, I think in the future, if we are going to develop something like what we call cosmopolitan law, or or to review or to revise the Charter of the UN, something like that, we have to think about this. This will actually be something I will actually be living. And for Professor Winter, yes, I agree. I have actually mentioned something related to Buddhist philosophy and Taoist philosophy, but that's not enough. Most of the resources I can find in the previous few years, in a limited period of time, most of them, they're Confucians. And that's actually the resources we have. And I think, I guess more cooperation should be done with the Taoist and Buddhist philosophers. And even in the area of religion, more conversation. But my personal experience is that, I mean, in my personal life, apart from my career, in my personal life, I do actually read some Buddhist philosophical writings as well, and those are actually very inspiring. But I'm still thinking of a way how to connect them, how to bridge them to my academic study. So maybe still need some time. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Lee. Thank you, everyone. I'm afraid we're a little bit over the limit of our time. Unfortunately, there is no time anymore to ask the questions to the public, but I repeatedly wrote in the chat, so there were no written questions coming. So I hope we did not take opportunity from anyone who wanted to speak out. I would like to thank all our speakers for today. It was a brilliant discussion. And I would also like to thank Dr. Lee for the last positive note, actually all of our speakers, because you brought our subject, our discussion to the line where we tried to find out the common ground for the whole world to unite. Probably rethink the term of cosmopolitanism in other wording. And on this positive note, I would like to finish our today's discussion. Thank you once again. And I hope we will continue in the same manner. Looking for further discussions, international discussions, and cross-cultural discussions that will bring us to the best positive notes we can find. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.